So we've talked about, in chapter 4, we've talked about inducing vomiting and stopping vomiting, and now we're going to talk about diarrhea. So we're going to start with stopping diarrhea. And diarrhea, just like vomiting, it is a protective mechanism for the body to remove things from it that are causing irritation or other problems. But there is a point where it can become dehydrating, just like the vomiting can. So there's different types, there's different ways to treat the different types. I think you can see one potential cause right here. This is a case of dietary indiscretion by this boxer and got into the trash, going to eat something that maybe has been sitting there for a while that's full of bacteria that is going to cause some problems in the GI tract. And some diseases can cause this problem. Parvovirus, it's a viral infection that affects the GI tract and can result in a secretory and then exudative type of diarrhea that can be very dehydrating to animals. It can be hemorrhagic. There's bleeding from the intestinal tract just kind of sloughing off. That's kind of a big one in the veterinary world. In pigs, there's transmissible hemorrhagic gastroenteritis, same kind of thing. It's a virus that causes that sloughing of the GI tract. In any event, we want to look at the cause and then we can better select something that's going to treat that particular cause. So the four different causes, these are broad categories and some of them actually go together, are osmotic or malabsorption. This type of diarrhea occurs when something indigestible is in the GI tract or just not very absorbable. It can be a lot of fiber. We use this, in fact, to help with constipation. Simply having something in that goes through the GI tract and cannot absorb the fluid will provide or stimulate some of that fluid to come out of the GI tract. With it, it will pass very quickly. So it's just drawing water into the GI tract itself. Secretory diarrhea occurs when we have an overgrowth. This is the typical thing. Something has caused the die-off of our good abdominal or intestinal bacteria and an overgrowth of the bad intestinal bacteria that produces endotoxins. And I talked about this back in the anti-inflammatory chapter. These endotoxins will then cause a lot of secretion to occur in the GI tract, and a lot of fluid will be lost with that secretion. So things like in people, we have E. coli bacteria, the wrong type causing these types of problems too. And there's a whole variety in animals. When we think about what animals eat, it can be amazing that they get these types of diarrheas, but it's mostly because we've disturbed the GI tract flora, the bacteria that then allow the bad type to proliferate. Exudative, and this can result from secretory. Exudative diarrhea is when we actually get a breach of the mucosa itself. We're down to further layers into blood vessels, and we get proteins and fluid, and in the worst case, red blood cells leaving the GI through the GI tract. And depending on where it's leaving in the GI tract, it's either going to be red or kind of a cranberry color mixed with other, tissues that are kind of sloughing on the inside, or it can be black and tarry like we experience with gastric ulcers. But the end result is that is a really bad type of diarrhea because it is causing the loss of more than just fluid. Now we've got red blood cells, we've got proteins, and that is what can happen in parvovirus in puppies, and they just can't withstand losing a lot of fluids. And then motility. The motility of the GI tract can be affected, so it's not coordinated, and it's either retaining feces or it is going too fast and sending things out before things are absorbed, and it basically then kind of puts it into the osmotic or malabsorption type of diarrhea, in that there's just not enough time to convert that food into fecal material in the appropriate way. So it's just coming out too fast. And it's important to know about how food travels through the GI tract. And there are a combination of two different types of contractions, and these are segmental. Again, I can't make the hand movements that you can't see my hand movements. But if you look at this tube and there's different areas where there's arrows pushing in, it's just these segmental or mixing contractions are pushing in from the sides and causing a mixing. The material is not progressing so much as just mixing in place. Those are segmental contractions. And then we have to have a way for it to move through the GI tract. So we have peristaltic or um, propulsive wave contractions. So these are actually pushing the ingesta through the intestines in a particular direction, and it's a kind of a wave is the way that it moves through there. So these actually move. We need to have enough of the segmental one so that we have enough time for absorption, and we're mixing things in placing and allowing it to digest. But then we also need to move it through the intestinal tract. Okay, so we're going to talk about modifying motility first. And one type that does this are narcotic or opioid analgesics. So it's been noticed that when uh, animals have been given opioids around surgery, sometimes they wake up and their GI tract is very still for a long time. Um, uh, Repeated use of opioids results very commonly in constipation, and this just has to do with the fact that it modifies the intestinal motility so that things are not passing through as fast as they normally would. So we use this side effect to our advantage in helping to slow motility. So if things are moving through too fast, we can use an opioid type of um, motility modifier for the GI tract. There are over-the-counter versions of this. Even though these are narcotics, they're not considered to be scheduled drugs. They do not have the potential for abuse as far as causing the psychoactive type effects. They just mainly cause this effect of modifying the motility of the GI tract. There are more powerful prescription versions, but for the most part, we usually stick to the over-the-counter types. So the two types that are pretty readily available are Lomotil and Imodium. So diphenoxylate is Lomotil. I'm sorry, it's Lomotil. So there's diphenoxylate, which is Lomotil, and loperamide, which is Imodium AD, AD for antidiarrheal. And the over-the-counter versions contain atropine. Atropine is a is a is an anticholinergic. It tends to decrease secretions in the mouth, so it slows down some of the parasympathetic effects. It will decrease. It causes a dry eye and dry mouth, and that usually is pretty as a deterrent to people abusing this, because they would have to take a lot of it in order to have any kind of psychoactive effect. So it's hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard to abuse this drug in that way. And the side effect from the atropine usually makes people not want to do that. It combines with mu opioid receptors just like opioids do, and causes this effect of altering the motility in the GI tract. Um, One disadvantage of it is that we want to make sure that most of the if there's some offending feces or materials have moved through, because it's going to prolong the contact time of intestinal contents. So after an animal has passed a fair amount of things, then trying to slow it down will help them and hopefully not cause this contact time to be an issue. Collies and related breeds have some different things that go on in their intestinal tract. If you remember, I talked about how in the intestinal tract, some things that are absorbed are actually kicked back out into the GI tract with this P glycoprotein active transport systems. And they in collies and similar breeds, they do not have as many of these active transport mechanisms to basically kick it out of the system. So they absorb more, and therefore the sedative effect occurs with them. So it's just something to be aware of in these breeds. So I talked about with diarrhea, I talked about why don't we just uh, go after the parasympathetic nervous system, because that's the thing that seems to be a little overactive in some cases of diarrhea, and I mean of diarrhea and vomiting. Sorry, I was talking about vomiting in the last section. So these anticholinergic drugs, they block the cholinergic receptors. They are called parasympatholytic. So if you think about lysing or breaking, um, with that suffix, so parasympatholytic, we're going to stop the parasympathetic nervous system. It would seem like maybe that would help in cases of diarrhea. And what's happened is it's shown that it does not tend to have that great of an effect on diarrhea, and it will affect other parts of the body that we don't want to have affected. So if you think about lysing the parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to interfere with some other digestive properties that aren't so good, and there's other effects throughout the body. So we do not use them. There are antidiarrheals that block hypersecretions. We've talked about motility and we've talked about just suppressing the parasympathetic nervous system. So now we're going to talk about this hypersecrete or secretory diarrhea caused by hypersecretion. And what this is a lovely map of an outbreak of E. coli. I think this was the one that was associated with Chipotle. And basically, there is E. coli. It was a really bad strain of it because remember, we all have E. coli in our gastrointestinal systems. It helps us to break down food, but a bad type will cause the secretory diarrhea. It just makes a lot more fluid leak out into the ingesta, and then it leaves the body and it can lead to life-threatening dehydration. There's also inflammatory bowel disease causes the same thing, and this is the immune system going a little crazy on the GI tract. We're usually changing what we're feeding animals to help with that, but we may also use an antidiarrhea that will help with this type of hypersecretion. And organophosphate insecticides cause an overstimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so we get a lot of secretion that we wouldn't normally have as part of the toxicity of those insecticides. Anything that stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system can cause some of this secretion, oversecretion to occur. And the bad part about secretory diarrheas is they can become exudative. They can progress in the case of parvovirus, a virus that causes this secretion to occur. We can then get some degeneration of the inside of the intestinal tract and leading to blood being lost and proteins. So, what are our anti-secretory, the antidiarrheals?